The Lever. Subscriber-supported journalism that holds power accountable. As a Lever Premium subscriber, you'll get to hear exclusive bonus content from this episode and others in your feed. To become a subscriber, go to levernews.com.
From the Lever's reader-supported newsroom, this is Lever Time. I'm David Sirota. The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. These are the words that were published 75 years ago in George Orwell's novel 1984, and they seem to describe this political moment that we're now living through. After Joe Biden's severe decline was exposed to the nation on the presidential debate stage, Democratic Party officials have spent the last few days telling America to not believe their eyes and ears, and to think that Biden is up to the job of not only running for re-election, but serving another term in office. Concerns are now spreading like wildfire throughout the country amid revelations that Biden's health has been declining for some time and that his aides may have hid the situation. In response, Biden's campaign sent out a scathing email slamming the majority of American voters who polls show believe he should step down. And the email also insisted that there are no other Democrats who could possibly compete with Donald Trump. Meanwhile, the Biden family responded by holding a photo shoot with Vogue magazine after Biden's visit to the Hamptons, capping off this disaster with a let-them-eat-cake moment for the ages. All of this appears to be a huge boost for Donald Trump. Polling analyst Nate Silver's new report says the former president is now on track for a potential landslide victory in November. How in God's name did we arrive at this moment of peril? On this special episode of Lever Time, we talked to one of the people who tried to blow the whistle to avert this disaster, and who was punished for doing so.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
In March of 1968, incumbent Democratic President Lyndon Johnson announced that he would not run for another term. Though his approval ratings were better than President Joe Biden's are right now, Johnson seemed to understand that he'd lost the confidence of voters and probably couldn't win. Even though he'd enacted the most robust legislative agenda in a generation, the Vietnam War had politically destroyed him, so he bowed out. And had Robert F. Kennedy not been assassinated, there's a good chance Democrats would have prevented a Nixon presidency. 46 years later, we seem to be at a similar pivot point right now. Through the Federal Trade Commission, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the American Rescue Plan, Joe Biden has enacted some of the best economic policies America has seen since LBJ. And unlike LBJ, Biden got America out of a war. But polls show that Biden, too, has lost the confidence of the country because of his age and his health issues that everyone saw on live television last week. For those who don't want to see a Donald Trump presidency, the question now is, what should be done? Right now, Democratic Party powerbrokers are offering their answer to that question. They insist that nothing should be done, and the disaster should just unfold. Former President Barack Obama, for instance, was one of the first to weigh in, declaring that, quote, bad debate nights happen, and that the debate didn't change the dynamics of the race. Silicon Valley megadonor Reid Hoffman soon after declared that, quote, Joe is our nominee. Any decision to step aside is up to him and his family, period. Biden's former White House chief of staff doubled down against some donors who said they felt gaslit by DNC officials. He told the New York Times that, quote, big money donors don't get to dictate the nominee of the Democratic Party, an attempt to pretend that Biden staying in the race is somehow a selfless and brave act of populism. If you feel like you're being gaslit, it's because you are being gaslit. But it's now getting worse. This same cabal has gone on the attack against the rest of the Democratic Party. Delaware Senator Chris Coons, for instance, appeared on ABC's This Week to insinuate that all the governors and senators throughout the Democratic Party are weak and pathetic, and that somehow only the declining Joe Biden can win this election.
The stakes of this race couldn't be higher, and the only Democrat who's ever beaten Donald Trump is Joe Biden. He is our candidate for November, and he has the best shot to beat him.
The Biden campaign blasted out an email to thousands of voters saying much the same thing as Coons. Quote, "The bedwetting brigade is calling for Joe Biden to drop out. That is the best possible way for Donald Trump to win and us to lose." That same email included a poll that showed other prominent Democratic governors and cabinet officials and senators aren't necessarily polling better than Biden against Trump. So when it comes to the question of what happens now, the Democratic Party machine's answer seems to be a reprise of George Orwell's 1984. They're telling you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. In a sense, they're doing that very familiar thing that we've seen autocratic regimes do throughout the world. The move where the apparatchiks cling to power by pretending the incapacitated dear leader is still functional, and then the media tells the population everything is fine. Of course, these are not objective observers. Every Democratic Party politician and power broker saying nothing to see here stands to lose money, status, and employment if Biden does do the right thing and steps aside. They epitomize the dynamic Upton Sinclair described when he wrote that, quote, "It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." Perhaps worse, these Democratic power brokers and operatives don't really seem to care if Donald Trump wins the presidency. After all, in a new Trump era, they'll still be in control of the Democratic Party. They'll still be able to raise tons of money. The stakes in this election are low for them, so they seem fine with staying the course. But here's the thing. Risking another Trump presidency with an obviously incapacitated nominee is not fine for millions of women who want their reproductive rights protected. It's not fine for millions of people who don't want the livable climate incinerated. It's not fine for millions of people who don't want whatever's left of democracy to be shredded under an authoritarian conservative Trump regime. In light of that, when it comes to the question of what should be done, a more legitimate answer is what a new poll shows nearly 2/3 of Americans say, that Biden should step down and the Democratic Party should allow its own democratic processes to operate, processes like an open convention that haven't been allowed to operate for a very long time. So what would it take to turn that popular desire for a change into reality right now? The first answer is stop being sad. Instead, get angry. Get angry because what's been perpetrated is a cover-up and a crime against you and against the entire country. Let's remember, Joe Biden and his aides did everything they could to prevent a serious contested Democratic primary. And according to reporting in Axios, they did this as White House aides were well aware of Biden's declining health but said nothing. Even worse, Biden refused to engage his long-shot primary challengers in a debate that might have let Democratic voters see his frailties early enough for more established candidates to jump in. Instead, Biden and his aides defrauded the country. They tried to hide it all so they could get into a general election and now blackmail us with an impossible choice. Vote for an incapacitated Biden or get Trump and the end of democracy. But being angry alone about all this won't fix the situation. Anger channeled into relentless pressure might. Joe Biden insisting on running for re-election is selfish, but it's also the iron law of politics. Most politicians are narcissists with God complexes, and therefore will not give up power out of any sense of altruism or any sense of duty to country or anything else you've seen on a West Wing episode. As the old saying goes, power concedes nothing without demand. In this case, Biden will step down only if there is sustained public demand. Demand by you listening to this podcast, by all of your friends and neighbors, by everyone. So you're thinking, sure, Sirota, that all sounds great, but it's impossible. And look, that may end up being true. Biden and his family may be willing to sacrifice all of our futures for their venal attempt to cling to power. But then again, insisting that nothing can be done, that's a cheap cop-out, one designed to tell yourself that nobody has to do anything because it's already impossible. I reject that. I believe Nelson Mandela was right when he said, "It's always impossible until it is done." If your elected Democratic Party official is pretending things are fine, call them up and tell them that they are not fine. If your social media feed is full of liberals who've been brainwashed by MSNBC and they're telling you that Biden is the nominee and just shut up, tell them no. It doesn't have to be this way. If your friends and family have given up trying to speak out and are simply resigned to this disaster, yell at them. Tell them that the whole world is on the line here. Now, let's be honest. Biden stepping down is risky. But knowing what we know now about his frailties and his poll numbers, sticking with Joe Biden is just as risky and maybe even more risky. You may be worried, of course, that an open convention when Biden drops out might be unpredictable and messy and a bit chaotic. And I'm here to tell you that, yeah, it will be. Because guess what? Democracy is risky and unpredictable and messy. And that's okay. In fact, that's a feature, not a bug, of a functioning, healthy democracy. And that would be a beautiful thing. Let Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg and all those rising star Democratic governors compete for the support of the delegates who were elected to represent their communities at the Democratic convention. That's democracy. The stakes here could not be higher. We live in an age of the so-called polycrisis, multiple emergencies unfolding all at the same time. But this crisis right here, right now, is the biggest of all. Because it's about not even just preventing another Trump presidency. It's about whether we can ever actually envision any positive change at all. Think about it. Since Barack Obama transformed his rhetoric of hope and change into a policy of more of the same, and then we got MAGA and mayhem, the Democratic Party and its media machine have wrung any sense of hope for a better world out of its voters' minds. Where rank-and-file voters could once envision steady progress towards a better society, those dreams have been replaced by cold, bloodless calculation and resignation. In interviews and tweets and Facebook posts and conversations at the bar, Democratic voters today often sound like dime-a-dozen political strategists, obsessed only with what some pundit on television told them is supposedly politically realistic, but not obsessed with what might actually improve the country. Party leaders propping up Joe Biden are now relying on that demoralization to try to stay the course. They want voters to believe the die is cast, the fix is in, and that we can't ever deviate from a worst-case scenario. They want you to believe that there's no alternative to the nomination of a declining 81-year-old man poised to lose to a cartoonish fascist who threatens to ruin your future and your children's future. They want you to believe that there's no possible way to turn the page and nominate any of the number of talented potential candidates across the country. They want you to believe that the Democratic Party that once passed the New Deal and civil rights laws and Medicare and Medicaid and voting rights laws, that this party can do absolutely nothing other than be a hollowed out vessel for a declining shell of a president, even though there's still time to make a change. So let me ask you, is that really where we are? I sure hope not, because right now, we're facing the very real threat of fascism and authoritarianism in the form of Donald Trump. He and his movement have laid it all out in their so-called Project 2025 documents that outline a fascist takeover of this country. Are we going to simply allow this kind of fascism to take over America just because Joe Biden's family likes the perks of the White House? Or just because Democratic politicians are too polite or too afraid to say the obvious to the elderly president withering away before our eyes? Of course, one elected official in the Democratic Party tried to do something about this way back when it would have been a more orderly, less chaotic situation. You may remember that after not a single statewide elected official in the entire Democratic Party mustered the guts to run a primary challenge against Biden, despite his plummeting polls, even after that, Democratic Congressman Dean Phillips stepped up and tried to run a primary against Biden. For the alleged crime of trying to run that primary and sound that prescient alarm, Dean Phillips was roundly ridiculed, berated, and drubbed out of the party. He recently announced he wouldn't run for re-election to his U.S. House seat.
Everybody in America can see what's going on. I think it's healthy for the United States to have men in their 80s as president. No, I don't. And by the way, it's not just me, it's about 75% of the country. So it is not my job to opine. What I'm saying is that Americans have made it clear they do not want either of these candidates as president. I'm glad to see the GOP having a healthy debate, many of the candidates right here in New Hampshire. And I wish President Biden would be here too. I wish he would debate.
The man who ran Dean Phillips' race was Jeff Weaver, who also helped run Bernie Sanders' 2 presidential campaigns. Right now, Arjun Singh and I are going to talk to Jeff about how the Biden machine and the Democratic Party's hostility to democracy created this disaster we're now living through. And we also talk about what the Democratic National Committee and the Democratic Party as a whole can do right now to create a contingency plan if Biden does do the right thing and drops out.
Jeff, awesome to have you here. I'm excited to talk to you. I think, like David and probably most of America, I have no idea what is going on right now. Let's just do a quick recap. Since the debate, Biden, his allies, they've tried to promote this video of him at a rally in North Carolina where he acknowledges his own bad performance. But then they say, look how energetic he is. He can read off a teleprompter. You guys should be happy about that.
I don't debate as well as I used to. But I know what I do know. I know how to tell the truth.
His family meets at Camp David. They tell him to stick with the campaign. They start attacking the press, saying this is all an overblown media narrative. Then they say that his critics are the, quote, the bedwetting brigade. I guess, Jeff, just, you've been in politics a long time. You've had bad moments, I'm sure. Just as a tactic to calm the nerves, do you think that's smart? And how do you feel after the debate and after this weekend?
Well, look, I think they're basically in a waiting posture. And what they're waiting for is to see if over the course of 3 or 4 or 5 days, with a lot of surrogates out there, putting out their talking points, if the polls will stabilize and they'll limit the damage that was done by the really, I was going to say poor debate performance, but that's really understating what went on there. And so, the ultimate decision about whether he stays in or not is going to be made in a few days, not, this whole news about the family meeting and what have you. They were never going to come out of that meeting and say he's not running. They're going to wait and see what the polls say. And if the polls continue to plummet, then, he may get out. If they stabilize, then he's likely to stay in, I think.
Let's talk about, if he gets out. You have worked with sometimes in a hostile setting with the DNC, the Democratic Party machine. The common retort when one says that the party clamped down on primary challenges, for example, is that state parties made their own decisions on that, and there isn't really a central power there. In your experience, is the Democratic Party top down, where the party is and the power is concentrated? And how do they exert their influence over the rest of the party machinery when it comes to something like this?
Well, when you have a Democratic president, the president is the Democratic Party. Let's be clear. The party and the president are one. So there is no independent Democratic Party. The DNC is essentially a fundraising operation for the re-elect for the incumbent president. And the chair of the DNC does whatever the president's people tell that person to do. And so they also can call state chairs and tell those people what to do. They control, because the president is the party controls the purse strings and things like presidential appearances and so on and so forth. They call party chairs, and they tell party chairs what to do, and party chairs do it, whether it's in Florida, where they canceled the primary altogether, in North Carolina, where they kept people off the ballot that they had put on 4 years earlier when they were doing worse in the polls, to Wisconsin, where you had a relatively progressive state party chair who was complicit in trying to keep people off the ballot until the Supreme Court intervened. So that's how they. I mean, it's not like they can force anybody to do anything, frankly, but they make it very unpleasant.
So, Jeff, the man in the moment probably right now is arguably Dean Phillips, like the guy who sounded the alarm a long time ago. I went to New Hampshire, I interviewed him. And the thing I was most surprised by is not that he was charismatic, he was young. It was that this felt kind of like going back to a normal campaign where you have a candidate going out and speaking to voters. And it really underscored just how closed off Biden had been. And, one thing Dean had said, a lot of people had said is, are they trying to protect the president from people really seeing how bad he might be on the campaign trail? I will just say I had a Biden advisor one time text me, I get worried when he goes out by himself. And, you were an advisor to Dean Phillips. Last week, we re-aired our episode about the 2024 efforts that you had just talked about. From your perspective, when Dean Phillips tried to challenge him, did it feel like there were consequences for those challenges personally, professionally? Did that elicit anger from the party? And, what was there a pressure campaign, and what kinds of pressure did you guys feel coming from parts of the Democratic Party?
Well, there was incredible pressure, obviously, not just on the candidate. They started running a primary challenger against him, for one thing. That's always a good way to motivate incumbents. Until he said, he wasn't going to run, and so that lever of power was taken away from.
You're talking about in his House race.
Yeah, in his House race. Yes, exactly.
So they decided to challenge him, and they thought that was okay because he was challenging the president.
Yeah, exactly. And then obviously the pressure on, political professionals is intense. Yeah. The punishment that can be meted out there is severe financially to people who work in Democratic Party politics. And that was certainly the case in the Dean Phillips campaign. I can't tell you dozens and dozens and dozens of people I talked to, both campaign staffers and political consultants, who wouldn't touch that campaign with a 10-foot pole, even though they were sympathetic to the message that Dean Phillips had around the issue of Joe Biden's electability.
What drew you to the Phillips campaign, actually, Jeff?
Well, he approached me, frankly. We had quite a few discussions. He was open to Medicare for all, which he eventually, came out in favor of. Mm-hmm. He was for free tuition at public colleges and universities. And the truth is that the goal this fall has to be to defeat Trump, and more importantly, Trumpism, because, despite what you hear from a lot of Democratic talking heads, Trump is not personally an existential threat alone. It's his ideology, which is now being immersed in the Republican Party, and will be, implanted in the federal government if he gets reelected. Yeah. So we have got to defeat Trump not because of Trump, but because of Trumpism as an ideology. Mm-hmm. And, this is a global phenomenon, what's going on. We saw in France what's happening. You saw in Germany. You see it all over the world, this sort of move to the right. There's an article today about South Korean men becoming more conservative. The Israeli government is conservative. I mean, you have conservative governments rising all over the world, Hungary. And so this is part of that, obviously. And we have got to do our part here in the U.S. to stem that tide of authoritarian right-wing politics.
So I want to ask about what we're going through now, and through the prism of what happened in the primary, or really lack of a primary. It seems to me that one way to look at this moment, where you have a general election nominee who has lost the confidence of most of the country in his ability to govern, and it seems to me that a contested primary is supposed to test general election candidates before they get to this point in the political process. And I think my question about that is the hostility to a primary challenge against Joe Biden from Dean Phillips or anyone else. That hostility, there's always going to be a hostility from incumbents to facing a primary, but I just wonder, is that is the intensity of the hostility that a candidate like Dean Phillips faced, is that something newer in Democratic Party politics? Because it seems to me that there's a complete intolerance almost across the board, up and down the ballot. There's a complete intolerance to the idea of democratic contests inside of the Democratic Party, and now here we are. I just wonder, you having been in politics for as long as you have, do you sense that hostility has intensified? And if it has, why?
Well, incumbents, as you mentioned, incumbents always hate primary challengers. But let's talk about primaries. Primaries aren't just a way to pick a nominee. Primaries are an important feedback loop between the rank and file of the party and elected officials. If you run in a primary and you get 85% of the Democratic Party vote, well, probably the voters think a lot of you. If you get 52% and sneak over the line, well, then maybe you're getting a message sent to you by voters that there's a problem. And, that problem may be personified by the messaging of your opponent, and maybe you need to take a look at, where you are vis-a-vis your constituents. So, in addition to seeing how well candidates do in debates and whether they, obviously we saw, with some candidates, it exposes other problems. But, this feedback loop is incredibly important. And there's this real sense in the Democratic Party in Washington, D.C., and it is pervasive, that somehow the Democratic Party star chamber is wiser than the collective 100 million Democrats across the country. And every time they try to substitute their judgment for the judgment of rank and file Democrats, it ends in disaster. Obviously in 2016, we ended up with the star chamber chosen candidate Hillary Clinton losing to Donald Trump in a surprise. In 2020, the process was relatively open. Frankly, the party came out of it. Joe Biden won, and the party united because people felt invested in a fair process. Then in 2024 comes around, you have the complete rearranging of the schedule in order to protect Joe Biden. Let's be clear. I mean, even Jim Clyburn said in an article that the reason the schedule was changed was to protect Joe Biden. You canceled all the debates, which then drove RFK and Cornel West out of the Democratic Party contest. So now you create third-party challengers because you are not allowing open debates. Then you smash, Dean Phillips and anybody else who thought they would, even many who wanted to run but didn't run, so that you've covered up what is clear now that Joe Biden is having difficulties. So you've covered that up. So every time they substitute their judgment for the collective judgment of rank and file voters, it turns out to be a disaster, because the truth of the matter is that the Democratic star chamber in Washington, D.C. is really very out of touch with America and is incapable, frankly, of winning.
So my question early on throughout the whole primary, or really lack thereof, is, and no disrespect to Dean Phillips, I'm glad Dean Phillips, the one elected official in the Democratic Party who actually stepped up and tried to run a primary challenge, this is no disrespect to him, but the question I kept coming back to is, where are the governors? Where are the senators? Where are the traditional, bigger named, bigger platformed candidates that, when you look back in history, tend to have at least floated a potential primary campaign, if not run a potential primary campaign against such a weak incumbent? We've seen that in the past. So my question is, where were all the bigger name candidates? And how do we explain the lack of those primary candidates, especially knowing that those kinds of primary candidates have run in the past? What has changed?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, David. And as you know, Dean Phillips has said many times, he tried to recruit some of these people to run before he got in.
I've been trying this, I hope you guys know, since I called on the president to pass the torch. He didn't. I spent months literally calling other candidates who are much better known than I, because I know in this game you have to be well known. It helps the cause.
That's why I'm
the invitation poppy is
who?
still Gretchen Whitmer, J.B. Pritzker, Gavin Newsom, Vice President Harris. Where are you?
He wanted them to run. He wasn't looking to run himself. And as you know, he got in very late, and there's a million reasons why he didn't do well, but that being one of them. David, I don't know what the answer is. Obviously, people's political consultants and the candidates themselves made judgments that they'd be better off waiting until 2028, that maybe, with a no incumbent president, they could have a better chance of defeating Kamala Harris than they do Joe Biden this time around. I think it was a terrible miscalculation on people's parts, both because everybody now sees that Joe Biden is having physical problems. His poll numbers are still in the basement. Obviously there are large segments of the Democratic Party, particularly around the war in Palestine, who are disenchanted with the president. So there was a base there to grab onto. But it takes courage. It takes political courage to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to get at is there a sharper, harsher culture of fear? Like, I can't believe it's just that the culture in the Democratic Party is just people are too polite. I feel like
it's definitely not polite.
It's not right. It's not polite. I mean, tell me if you think I'm wrong, but my theory is that the Democratic Party and its media machine has sold the rank and file Democratic voter on the idea that intra-party competition, intra-party squabbling, fighting amongst the party is actually not democracy, which is what I think it is, but it's actually something bad. And so that the politicians, the governors or the senators who might have thought of running in looking at the incumbents' poor poll numbers, like in a past era, that now that there is this culture of fighting amongst Democrats is bad, and now that idea has seeped into the grassroots of the Democratic Party, that no statewide elected official, no major Democrat with a big platform wants to contend with that. Is that a fair way to look at it?
No, that is absolutely a fair way to look at it. And you hear it in some of the commentators who are on TV now, pro-Biden commentators who are out there. We can't, the president can't step aside. It'll be pandemonium. You'll have chaos at the convention. There'll be multiple votes, and there'll be
this is democracy.
People arguing. Right. You see, but you don't see where the Democratic Party operates. Republicans are much more likely to, as we saw in the House races for the Speaker over and over again, they're much more likely to bludgeon each other in public. The Democratic Party, the way you handle opponents is a quiet throat-slitting. That's the way you handle it. It's very quiet. It's very neat. Probably they put plastic on the floor ahead of time.
Covert action.
And to catch all the blood. But that's how they do it. And no one sees anything bad happening. It looks very calm on the surface. But that's how they like to project it.
Well, I see another side of the equation, which is that Democrats love to talk about in this era of Trump that we're not the cult of personality party. We don't do what they do. And I'll just say personally, I don't really know how else to read some of the fervent defenses of Biden. I mean, it was uniform. Everyone saw what they saw. He did not do a good job. We can pick apart what the reasons were, how bad it was. But this fervent defense of Biden feels very cult of personality. And to be honest, I'm someone who, I was 16 in 2008. So that's probably the first election that I really came in on. And maybe since 2008, maybe a little bit earlier, it does feel like Democrats do have cult of personality politics. In 2016, it was just a given that Hillary Clinton was supposed to be the nominee, even though you had a really powerful challenge from Bernie Sanders. I guess looking at all of this, I just wonder, why are Democrats like this? Is this something new? And over your time in politics, has that changed? And, why do they just rapidly coalesce around people in this cult-like way, despite what are very real deficiencies, despite the fact that they could have just had a big, fair process? And if Biden comes out at the top, I think a lot of people would have said, hey, you know what? We gave it our best bet. That's all right. Now we're going to go with the nominee. But instead they didn't. And it feels very cult-like. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's a cult around Biden because obviously there are divisions in the party. The Obama people hate the Biden people, hate the Obama people, and some of the Clinton people hate the Biden people, and so there are centers of power in the party. The party has increasingly become a presidential party. It is very focused on presidential politics. And I think you don't see the type of leaders, independent sort of power-based leaders in the, for instance, the legislative branch anymore. There's no Harry Reid, who, we all know was a adept political operator for good or ill, and sometimes for good, sometimes for ill. But he would intervene in a way with presidents and presidential aspirants. And I just don't think you see that kind of power in the legislative branch. There's no Tip O'Neill. There's no, there's no people like that who have independent power outside of the president. And so when we don't have a president, the party sort of is aimless and floats around. And then when you do have a president, it's totally focused around the presidency. And I think that's a big problem.
Yeah, we talked to on the show Mark Longabaugh. I don't think you guys might have worked together on the Bernie Sanders 16 campaign. Yeah. Mark had a really interesting point because I had asked him about the Ted Kennedy, Jimmy Carter primary, and the same question, how come someone didn't come up, a Ted Kennedy? And his point was, look, there isn't a Ted Kennedy at this moment, that Ted Kennedy was such a unique rock star in the party. Do you look at the Democratic bench and think that's true, that, even if, say, Gavin Newsom or Gretchen Whitmer, if they really wanted to mount that, they might not have been able to marshal that kind of star power? Was that an issue?
Well, certainly it's an issue. And look, you saw what they did in terms of, keeping Dean Phillips off the ballot. Would they have tried to keep Gretchen Whitmer off the ballot? Of course they would have. They would have tried, there might still not have been a contest in Florida, and they might have given all the delegates to Joe Biden or North Carolina. So it would have been, very, very messy. Obviously the need to amass massive quantities of money, particularly outside your campaign, not necessarily inside your campaign, but outside your campaign, in order to successfully prosecute a campaign for president, you really have to be certain that you have those kind of resources lined up. Bernie Sanders is a little bit sui generis, as we say, lawyers say, it's a thing unto himself. He was able to finance a campaign with small dollar contributions over 2 campaigns. He raised, $500 billion, but $500 million, but that's not everybody. You can't raise that type of money.
Right.
Well, and that's actually an important segue to the question of the donor class. How much does the lack of a vigorous primary process, a vigorous process that could have tested Joe Biden, could have challenged Joe Biden, how much of that is not just the culture in the Democratic Party that sort of presumes that intra-party fighting is bad, but how much of it is also that a handful of donors controls a disproportionate amount of the resources needed to run a well-resourced primary, and therefore, even if you are a governor of a state or a senator, that if you don't have access to those donors and those donors are locked down, there's really kind of no point in trying to run a primary because it can't be resourced.
Can't be resourced. Yeah, if you can't resource it, look, let's be clear. There's a world we live in and the world we're trying to create, and we have to know which one we're in. And right now, the world we live in, you cannot run for president without tens or hundreds of millions of dollars outside of your campaign to help you, because the other people will have it. And money doesn't always win. You don't have to have as much money as the next person, but you got to have a lot. You got to have enough. And when these people call around, and if the donors shut you down, the relatively small circle of donors shut you down, there's no point in running. You can't run. It is impossible to run. And we saw, you saw that in 2020. You saw candidates who were, tremendously under-resourced. It's more important to look at the resources in their affiliated super PACs than it is to look at their resources in their campaign. And you saw, candidates like Amy Klobuchar, but everyone thinks Amy Klobuchar, her outside resources, very little. And so it was difficult for her to prosecute the campaign much beyond New Hampshire. And this is true across the board.
The thing about the donors is interesting because now it seems like at least some donors are starting to speak up and starting to show their concern at these fundraisers. I think he was with Phil Murphy, the governor of New Jersey, at a fundraiser where some donors were asking what happened at the debate. Is this sustainable? Let's move forward to a little bit of a hypothetical scenario. So let's say we get to the convention. There seems to be enough energy to say that Biden needs to step aside. I think there's a few different ways that could happen. So in the event that Biden comes out and says, look, I'm going to step aside, what does that actually mean for the nomination? He has all these delegates he won in primaries. So do his delegates just get freed up? Like, can he tell them, I'm going to step down, but you have to vote for Kamala Harris or a different candidate? Or are they just unshackled and they can do whatever they want?
Yeah, they are unshackled. And look, in terms of time, many European countries have full-blown elections in the amount of weeks we have between now and the Democratic convention. So to say that you can't have a primary between now and then is a little bit ridiculous. But I mean, if he were to step aside, say tomorrow, all of his delegates would be unbound, and they could vote for whomever they wanted. In a world where the Democratic Party had an interest in picking the best candidate, they might announce that they're going to hold 2 debates with, say, 10 top candidates between now and the convention.
Yeah.
Those candidates could campaign around the country. Obviously there won't be any voting, but there'll certainly be a lot of polling. And, polls are one way you find out what people think. And then you go to the convention, you make presentations, and, you don't have to have 100 ballots. You could say we're going to have a ballot, and each time we have a ballot, the lowest person falls off. And so if you had 10 candidates, you'd have at a max 10 ballots. It doesn't have to be chaos. It doesn't have to be pandemonium. Deals might be cut. This is a process you wouldn't want to do every time, but it's much more democratic than a process where Joe Biden drops out and the party anoints somebody and says nobody else can run. And let's be clear, this process that I just described, it's similar to the process that Democrats used before 1972 to pick all,
Right.
JFK was picked in this process, FDR was picked in this process, Truman was picked in this process, Adlai Stevenson was picked in this process. So, it's not like it's not been used before. It is less democratic than the normal process we use, but that was circumvented this time around. So let's do the most democratic thing we can do at the moment.
And let's be clear. I think people forget that primaries, even a convention, the primaries are somewhat of a democratic process, and I want to underscore somewhat, in the sense that the primary is actually just electing delegates
Correct.
to go represent your community or your state at the convention. The point being is that that's not a perfectly democratic process where you're sort of directly voting for the candidate, you're voting for the candidate's delegates. But it seems to me that the reason a convention exists is in part for this particular kind of situation where a candidate potentially drops out or becomes incapacitated, and the delegates are small d democratically elected to represent their communities in selecting another candidate. Now again, that's not a perfectly democratic situation, but it seems like a somewhat democratic situation. And it seems like it's the kind of thing that the Democratic Party is terrified of. And I want to get to this point, which is that it seems to me, whether it comes to primaries, contested primaries, or now the prospect of an open convention, right? A not rigged, not smoke-filled backroom anointed candidate, an actual open convention where different candidates compete for the support of delegates, that the Democratic Party, or at least parts of the Democratic Party, whether it's the donor class, the politicians, the power brokers, that they actually are terrified specifically of that. Do you agree with that? And if you do agree with that, why are they so afraid of that?
Yeah, they are. They're terrified of it, and it's because it can't be managed in the way that you can. They want a show. They want an Oscar award show that's like heavily choreographed, and there's a red carpet, and everybody comes in. They give their speeches, and when your speech is done, the hook comes out and pulls you off. That's what they want. It's a show that they put on for the American. And just like, it's not just the Democrats. Let's be clear. The Republicans also put on a show. But there's a fundamental distrust in many corners of the party in Washington of rank and file Democrats and democratically aligned independents. They just don't trust them. They think they know better. They're wiser.
So that raises the question about, let's talk about Kamala Harris for a second. How much, well, before we get to her and an open convention, I think the first question about Kamala Harris, the vice president, is how much do you think some of the hesitation to push Biden to drop out has to do with a legitimate, authentic fear that Kamala Harris is a weak general election candidate, and the presumption is that she would automatically be the candidate, and that thus and so dumping Biden for Kamala Harris doesn't really solve the problem if the problem is defeating Donald Trump?
Right. Well, that has to be the only. I mean, to me is the only consideration. What is the path most likely to defeat Trump. And to me, it seems like it's this open process that I just described. Are there concerns if Kamala Harris was the candidate that, her polling numbers are also not fantastic? Although I will say that, in her rebuttal at the end of the debate when she went on to defend the president, she was, she's good on TV. She's good on, she's a good candidate. She's a good politician. And you're like, oh, she's not infirm. And so, could she come out and run and do better than her current poll numbers? Yeah, of course. She has some upside. We haven't seen a lot of her. The Biden people have sort of kept her locked away for the last few years. And when they did bring her out, they gave her impossible tasks. You couldn't, I'm not saying that I support Kamala Harris, but I'm just saying, yes. So the short answer to your question is yes. That is a concern. Yes. And, what is really exacerbated by is the sort of abysmal campaign that she ran in 2020. She raised a lot of money, went out the door very quickly. She had a minor blip up when she, attacked the president for his past votes on busing or what have you, support of busing or not, opposition to busing, but then never could capitalize on it and sort of, collapsed rather quickly. And so that's, I think, is the real concern about Kamala Harris, is that she can't prosecute a successful campaign.
So I'm of the mindset that, I'm very much like David, that I think a primary is healthy, but I also think in a media environment, the primary actually does a good job of stealing the oxygen from Trump. Yes. I thought with the 2020 primaries, I loved it. I loved how all these candidates are dropping policy proposal after policy proposal. And if you saw for months, the media was obsessed with Medicare for all, tuition-free public college. How are we going to do it? And you didn't have kind of the media class pushing down, saying, oh, it's unrealistic, move on, because every candidate needed to capture these votes. These actually moved into the arena of viable ideas. But to the Kamala Harris point, a big constituency for Democrats historically has been Black voters, and in particular for Joe Biden's election, Black women. They were crucial to his win in Georgia, knocking doors. Is that a big problem if Kamala Harris is passed over? Does it look like he's scorning potentially the first Black female president, the first Black female vice president? And do Black voters risk getting alienated from the party because of this? How do you think about that kind of stuff on a campaign? Because it feels very heady and hard to think of groups as blocks, but you've both been in this game before. How do you kind of disentangle and grapple with these issues? Is that something that is a scenario to be worried about, that Black women and Black voters feel totally alienated, that they don't go to the vice president immediately?
Well, I don't think they should go to the vice president immediately, no matter who it is, frankly, in this type of scenario. And I do think Kamala Harris, if we had a more open process, would be an incredibly strong contender, and probably the favorite, frankly. So it's not a process that is disadvantaging her. I mean, she, like I said, I think would probably go in with a big head of steam and might lock it up fairly quickly. So. I don't think I'm never afraid of a democracy, and as long as the playing field is level and everybody gets a fair shot, it's just what we were talking about in 2020. I mean, progressives lost in 2020 and rallied around Joe Biden because they believed it was a fair process, and that Bernie and his supporters have been treated decently, and the Biden people were gracious winners in that time period. So, it is a concern. But I don't think it's an overriding concern.
Well, what do you say to folks who hear about Biden may drop out, there will be a convention, and that it therefore automatically must be inevitably impossible for it to be anyone else other than Kamala Harris? Now, I look at that theory and I say, well, on the one hand, the way democratic politics has tended to work is, yes, exactly. There's a cabal that picks and chooses, and democracy is not allowed to flourish. There is no open floor fight convention. There's just a succession, if you will. The other side of me says, you know what? We're in uncharted territory here, and it doesn't have to be that way, even if it. If passed as prelude, it might lean towards being that way. I guess my question is it inevitable? that if Joe Biden drops out, there will simply be no process at all. And Kamala Harris, without even having to make a campaign for those delegates, that she will be anointed. Is that an inevitability?
No, absolutely not. I mean, is it a possibility? Absolutely. Is it a likelihood? Probably.
And would it be bad?
Yeah, well, look, I think you saw, what happened when they wouldn't let Joe Biden debate in the primaries. We had this debate when we're coming into the general, and now people are like, holy smokes, we should have had debates in the primary. I don't think the test that we put, Joe Biden to should be different than the test we put Kamala Harris to. She should have to debate other potential contenders for the presidency, so people can compare and contrast the candidates side by side. I mean, maybe she got on the stage and she'll kill it.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And maybe she won't. I mean, and the same is true for some of these other candidates.
Totally.
I mean, let's be clear. People talk about Whitmer and Newsom and Pritzker and my friend Roukhana and a bunch of other people. You haven't seen them in a national debate. I mean, I can tell you, having worked on 2 presidential campaigns, and David, you know this as well, there are some candidates who look so good on paper
right.
and step on that debate stage and they just fall flat on their face. And others, other people join the presidential race who everybody writes off, people like Bernie, he's there, and suddenly they take off like a rocket ship. So, and you can't tell who that is until they actually engage.
The thing about Biden, though, is he's a really stubborn guy. Now it sounds like his family is telling him to keep the good fight. He has this mentality that the more people tell him that he shouldn't do something, the more likely he's going to do it simply to prove them wrong. Like his campaign released an ad with that Chumbawamba song.
When you get knocked down, you get back up.
I get knocked down. Look, I'm just going to ask what I think a lot of people are asking. If this guy refuses to step down, if he continues to show what appeared to be a very frail and weak person, is there a way to essentially force him off the ticket unless he steps down? Like, is that the only place we're in, is that he has to be the one to make this decision?
I mean, for all practical purposes, that's the case. I mean, technically, no. Technically, could the delegates revolt and vote for somebody else at the convention? They could, but that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
The chances of that happening are like zero.
Because that's ahistorical, right? That's never happened, right?
No, it's not. It's just not going to happen. I mean, technically under the rules, the Democratic, your pledged delegates are not quote unquote bound to you.
Yeah.
You have your obligation is to reflect the sentiments of the people who sent you there. So, what does that mean at the time they voted? Does that mean now? When does that mean? So it's kind of squishy, but let's be clear. There is not going to be like deposing Joe Biden. That's not happening.
What happens if Joe Biden actually becomes incapacitated? I think there's actually a genuine concern that some people might have that if he exerts himself too much to show this defiance, it can take a toll on, it would take a physical toll on anyone. Let's say a nominee is actually incapacitated. Does that mean the vice president assumes the presidency and becomes the de facto nominee? Like, I guess more of just from a technical party standpoint.
You're saying post-convention, too. Like, what happens
post-convention, too, because she will become the actual president by the Constitution. What happens to the party? Is it then that, that's who is going to be running? What do you think would happen in that scenario?
Well, I'm not sure about the substitution rules. I bet they're different in different states, frankly, substituting candidates. And it also depends when. If it happens the day after the convention, it's probably different than if it happens a week before the general election when ballots are printed. Many people have already voted. So technically, if Joe Biden were to win, having been incapacitated, then Kamala would be elected vice president, Kamala Harris, and then she would just assume the presidency. Right? I assume that the cabinet would use its constitutional power to remove him and put her in his place, which is what they should do, frankly.
And I think this is a scenario that actually we have to think about because Kamala Harris would be put as the vice president on ballots. If people had already submitted their votes, is there any way the Trump campaign could try some legal trickery, basically, to try and say, hey, all these people didn't vote for Kamala Harris administration, they voted for the Joe Biden administration or Joe Biden? Legally, could they mount some sort of, frankly, dumb legal challenge to try and gin up like he did in the last election that, hey, this isn't totally on the level?
I'm sure anybody can sue anybody. I just don't think that. I don't think that'll have a lot of legs personally. But can they try to cause mischief? I'm sure they will.
Yeah.
try whenever possible. But
so let's talk like tactics right now. If you are a Democratic politician, you are an activist, you're an organizer, you're part of you're in a grassroots group or a labor union, et cetera, et cetera. Right now, the pressure is amping up on Joe Biden to drop out. I think tactically, one question that is coming up is, at what point does that pressure go from constructive and productive to counterproductive in the goal of defeating Donald Trump, right? There's like a specific point in time where you're like, we got to get a stronger nominee to defeat Trump. And then there's a moment where it's like, okay, for whatever reason, good or bad, Joe Biden is simply not going to get out of the race. How do you think about how to calibrate that kind of calculation?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a good point, David, because you are right. There is a point at which it becomes, even this conversation becomes sort of counterproductive. And, there are people in the party who would say we're already at that point because Joe Biden said he's staying in. But, as I mentioned at the top of the program, I think that, right now they're in a holding pattern. They're doing what I would do if I were in their shoes. You put out surrogates, you try different talking points. It's too late. You don't like Kamala. Back in, the president's had a bad day. So, they're going to wait until the polls come in. Now, if he sinks 10 points in the polls, 10 points in the polls, then I think the conversation needs to continue because then you're clearly on a path to lose, right? And there's nothing, you can't do more damage than losing. I mean, losing is losing.
Well, I mean, the counter question is the other side of the question is, how much damage do you think the Biden team is doing to the rest of the party
That's a good question too.
By fueling this idea that no other candidate in the Democratic Party can defeat Donald Trump? I mean, they literally sent out an email saying that, citing a poll showing that other potential candidates were not doing as well as Joe Biden against Donald Trump, which in my view is a self-own, right? Like those candidates were doing actually pretty almost as well as Joe Biden, and they're not even running. So it's kind of like a self-own. But I think the flip side is like, if it's Joe Biden putting out information saying Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania is weak and Mayor Pete is a weak candidate and Kamala Harris is not as strong as Joe Biden, how much residual damage is the Biden team doing? How much are they damaging the party itself in trying to wage that kind of campaign?
Well, I think I worry less about Mayor Pete and Josh Shapiro than I do about the down ballot people who are running. I mean, we've already seen, Bob Casey now has an ad against him. I don't know if you saw it or not, where they're basically calling Bob Casey a liar for having defended the president's capacity. So I think you're going to see a lot more of that, and it's going to be very difficult for some of these swing state Democrats, not on ideological grounds, but on the basis of whether Joe Biden is capable of carrying on as president after another election. They're going to have to stand up and defend that position, and it's going to hurt the credibility of some of those candidates.
Okay, so the final question for you is I hate to ask you to prognosticate or bet on what's going to happen, but I'm going to ask you to give us your educated guess on what's going to happen. Educated in that you've been in this world, in this space for a long, long time. If you had to bet on how things are going to unfold, does Joe Biden stay in? Does he get out? Where are we right now? Is this just a momentary media storm, or is this actually a pivotal historic moment? Where do you come down on that? How would you bet?
Well, I know a lot more in a week when I see the polling in a week, because I think that'll be determinative of what happens. I mean, at this point, if the president does not see a precipitous fall in his numbers, I assume he will stay in and move forward. And, those of us who want to defeat Trump will have to support Joe Biden. And, let's hope this
and just to be clear, you're talking about head-to-head numbers, right? I mean, because the number that I see that I get that's concerning is somebody said, he he didn't go down after the debate, right? Like the day after polling or whatever didn't go down. But I saw another analyst make the point that it's hard to judge the effects of what we're talking about because they're kind of diffuse. It takes a while to seep in, so that when you see a number that says 72% of people do not have confidence in Joe Biden's cognitive ability to be president, that while that may not show up in the head-to-head versus Trump, it has, I guess, residual diffuse effects that are hard to poll. So I guess this just one quick follow is like what numbers should we be looking at that are actually the most salient here? Is it just sort of the head-to-head, or is it something else?
But not the national head-to-head, because it's really not important if Joe Biden loses 5 points in California or New York State. Like, who cares? Or Donald Trump goes up 10 points in Indiana. Doesn't matter. But how's he going to do in Michigan? How's he doing in Pennsylvania? How's he doing in Nevada and Arizona and Wisconsin and states like that? That's, Georgia, which is obviously a tougher state this time than it was last time. That's what's going to matter. If Joe Biden is going to lose 2 or 3 of those states, then we know we're going to lose. So then we have to do something, because something is better than a sure loss. Let's have at least a fighting chance of winning.
Oh, wait, I do have one more question that has come up.
One more
follow-up. Right.
Yeah.
This is an important one, which is that some folks are going to look at the polls and say, well, Biden's head-to-head with Trump. Kamala not doing as well in those same polls against Trump. And Gavin Newsom isn't doing as well. I could name the list, Pritzker, whoever, Shapiro, whoever. What's your take on this idea that Biden, because he is polling better against Trump than anyone else, that he is the least risky option? And I think the baked into that question is, do you think that if another candidate who is less well known right now became the nominee today, that there would be enough time for them to ostensibly catch up? I guess what I'm trying to ask is that I think people look at these numbers and they say, well, if Newsom isn't polling as well as Biden against Trump, it must mean that Newsom is weaker against Trump, as opposed to Newsom isn't actually running against Trump, and so people aren't evaluating him as a potential nominee. I'm just using Gavin Newsom as a placeholder, right? So, what's your take on all that? Like, that Biden is the least risky based on polls in the snapshot now, and how quickly do you think other candidates could sort of catch up to where Joe Biden is?
Well, if you look at those polls, you see that the race at Biden-Trump is fairly well set with a very narrow group of undecideds, and you see the same thing in a Kamala Harris-Trump, because those candidates are very well known. The other candidates who don't have as big a number as Joe, Trump often in those cases has a smaller number than he does against Joe, and there's a much bigger group of undecideds, which is what you would expect with a little. So I think all those other candidates have a much higher upside, ultimately, than what Joe Biden has. And let's be clear about this race. This race is, whoever the nominee is on the Democratic side is going to get at least 48% of the people who vote for either that candidate or Donald Trump, right? So really you have this 4% in the middle between Trump and this other candidate who are going to make the decision. And so you don't, I said drop 10 points, but you don't have to drop 10 points. If you drop half a point in Michigan, or 3/4 of a point, which sometimes is difficult to detect in the polling, given the margins of error. But if you start seeing real erosion in those states, that's time to hit the panic button. And what I'm counseling is, let's not have a situation where we have to hit the panic button. The party should announce, if the president doesn't resign, if the president stops running, steps aside, then this is going to be the process. And I think that they should have that in place so that they can execute it if needed.
And you're saying they don't have that in place right now?
No, I think that there are different power centers in the party. Some will want to just appoint Kamala Harris. There'll be other people who want a different process. It will vary. But the voices you're hearing right now coming out of Washington, I think there'll be a very strong effort to anoint Kamala Harris as the nominee.
It is a reminder, as I've always thought, perceive, I think people who are not in politics perceive that there's a cabal of people behind the scenes, like a smoke-filled room with people twirling their mustaches and like six people making a decision. And in some ways, that's more reassuring in a weird kind of dark way than the idea that like no one's running the show. Like no one's flying. Nobody's flying the plane. Nobody's nobody's in control. And it kind of feels like right now there's like a conflict. Like there's some power brokers who are trying to exert control, but nobody, by the way, including the president himself, seems to really be in control of a completely fluid situation. And
you basically have a plane on autopilot with all the passengers fighting to take the wheel, right? That's how. And sometimes one person has the wheel, but then sometimes they get pushed out of the way, and then sometimes two or three people gang up on one, and the alliances change. That's what it's like.
So it's Con Air. That's what we're living in right now.
It's a bumpy ride. It's a very bumpy ride.
Yeah, it's Con Air, exactly. Jeff Weaver, thank you so much for taking time with us.
Yeah, great to have you.
My pleasure. Anytime.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Lever Time. This episode was produced by Arjun Singh and myself. We'll be back later this week with another episode of Lever Time.